Welcome to Living with Purpose. Join Todd and his guest, renowned neuropsychologist Dr. Paul Nussbaum, in a two-part series discussing social isolation and the loneliness epidemic and practical advice for families navigating these challenges.
Dr. Nussbaum, welcome. And if you wouldn't mind, maybe just give us a little bit of your background and what you're involved in at this point in your career.
Sure. Thanks, Todd, for having me, and hello to all my friends at New Perspective. It's wonderful to be together again and on this podcast as we talk about an important topic. So I'm a neuropsychologist by training and licensed in Pennsylvania and here in Florida. A million years ago, I came out supposedly with some expertise in older adults and aging and disorders of the brain, such as Alzheimer's disease and stroke and Parkinson's. And about 15 to 20 years ago, I became very interested in health. And so looking at those conditions from sort of the other side of the equation and saying, how can all of us, what can we do to really build up what is known as brain resilience, the health of our brain across our lifespan, regardless of age. And I trademarked a brain health lifestyle, and I've been really touring the country and the world to some degree, working with different entities, different organizations, different companies, mothers and dads across the dinner table, educating everyone that I can about the miracle between the ears, the human brain, and how we can shape it for health across the lifespan.
That really solidifies, I think, why you're being asked today to speak to our audience. Both seniors, but also their adult children, and trying to help people better understand how do we end up living longer, living happier, and better lives. And so that's what we're going to be discussing today. Just as a beginning note, I found a study that was done actually at the University of Glasgow. The evidence they found through their research is that social isolation and loneliness does in fact hinder good health, and it puts older adults at risk. And I'll maintain, and we can discuss this more, but I'll maintain it puts probably almost all of us at risk, social isolation and loneliness. What they found was that it caused things like high blood pressure, heart disease, obesity, a weakened immune system, which then, of course, opens the door for lots of problems. Also, they found it represented anxiety in a lot of these seniors who were socially isolated and obviously lonely. Depression, cognitive decline, and obviously it could result in death if it were prolonged long enough. How do we learn how to navigate through social isolation situations and loneliness in, again, seniors, but also their adult children?
Yeah, so it's really social isolation and loneliness. It's important to kind of think of them as two distinct things. And social isolation can occur, for example, because of poor transportation, because of lack of connectivity to technology, because of the pandemic that occurred, right? And so some people that are socially isolated are at high risk for a lot of the different medical conditions you just talked about, Todd, but they may not necessarily be lonely. So loneliness can occur with somebody who's not socially isolated. Interestingly, as we look at those two entities, and oftentimes they go together, but not always. But as we look at the overall prevalence of social isolation and loneliness, it is a significant problem for older adults. Today, you and I are talking about the risk for older adults, and it's a terrific, significant problem. I don't mean that in a good way. Well over 40% of older adults, meaning 60 years of age and over, Todd, have reported social isolation and loneliness. And so I think one of the first things that's really important for those of us in senior living and even in the acute care system is to be open about it and to ask questions.
Do you see it being more pervasive now than maybe in the recent past? And would that maybe be due from results of the pandemic?
There's no question the pandemic created enormous psychological and interrelational deficits for all age groups. We're still the issue of mental health problems in the younger adults and kids who had stayed out of school and weren't with their peer groups is still not talked about or understood enough now. And in particular, the same can be said for older adults. The thing older adults have is a bit of resilience that maybe the younger generation hasn't built up yet. So everybody needs to understand social isolation and loneliness can be thought of in the same way we think about the problems related to smoking behavior and even obesity and the epidemic of that. And the other factor is we live in a time now, Todd, where things are just much more rapid. Technology has kind of separated us in terms of being with one another. One of the things research shows that, particularly with older adults, in-person connectivity is better than using technology. Now, technology has its advantages, no doubt, but it's always going to be better if we interact human to human. That's the way our DNA works. So because our culture is more technology driven now, because, for example, people stay at home, they don't go to the work site, people are getting food delivered to them, people get their packages delivered to them. It's almost as if we're remaining in our caves and not getting out there and being with one another as much. So I think those are factors that are going into the perception that one has that we call loneliness. I feel alone, I feel lonely. It's an emotional reaction to what's going on.
Do you have a few things for advice that an adult child could look for in their senior, let's just say their parent, their mom or dad, who is living alone? What would be some of the telltale signals that you might suggest that they look at or look for when they're visiting and in the company of their loved one?
Yeah, so I would say to look towards the emotionality of your loved one. It's important to understand that, gosh, we've got some parents out there and grandparents who maybe are in their 80s or 90s, and you know what, son of a gun, they like to be alone, okay, and there's no problem with that. That's what they want, but you'll pick it up with their emotional response to that, and we have to respect that. But it's different from someone who's been historically pretty socially engaged, had a pretty vibrant social network of friends and colleagues and attended groups and things, and suddenly they're kind of withdrawn more. They're not showing the interest to get out much anymore. In senior living, you know this, Todd, we're not seeing Mr. Jones or Mrs. Jones coming out of his or her room as much. They don't want to attend activities, and that's a different animal. That's where the adult child really has to dig a little bit deeper and begin to ask questions about, how are you feeling? What is it that, you don't find that as joyful anymore? That's not as interesting to you anymore, because that's really where the negativity comes in, is that emotional response, which tends to be depressive. It tends to be maybe anxious. It tends to be withdrawal. And that leads to social isolation, not just being away from humans, but the brain emotionally and cognitively being isolated, which is dangerous to all the health outcomes you talked about earlier, Todd. I'll throw a question out to everybody that's watching this, and you can even, at New Perspective, ask everybody in a room, have you ever asked yourself if you're lonely? Have you ever asked anybody that you love, your mom, your dad, your spouse, your kids, your grandkids, your grandparents, are you lonely? I've asked that question to thousands and thousands of people across the planet. It's an odd question. It's not a question you and I ask a lot, and yet you and I are talking about it now. And so that's one of the first things we have to do, is get used to asking that out loud. And it's enormously important, because a lonely person, think about it, a lonely person is not going to volunteer that. And so that goes to a little bit of what you were just asking about, which is what can I do? How do I observe loneliness? Because this person's not going to tell me.
Yeah.
So if we reach out a hand and we give them the opening by asking the question,
right,
research suggests that that lonely person, that socially isolated person, really jumps on that and begins to talk. And that's the first step to the therapeutic sort of process.
In the next episode, Todd and Dr. Nussbaum will explore the value of senior living communities to combat loneliness and build stronger connections.